And just be aware of your breath. As you follow the arising and subsiding of the breath, each time your breath subsides, just be aware of the still point. Still point from which the breath arises again. And then subsides back into. Just feel the stillness. And let go into the stillness. That stillness is a dynamic, alert awareness. And just let yourself be absorbed into that awareness. that stillness, that awareness. It's the resonance of presence. Let go. As you ease into that stillness, and your own awareness is permeated by that stillness. Let the resonance of that presence absorb you. I want to tell you a story about a boy from Texas. Unfortunately, a few of you have heard the story. But as with all stories, I'll embellish it a little bit. This young boy, about 19, living in this godforsaken place called Odessa, Texas, found himself at a place where he was really questioning the value of life. What's all this talk about life? And one dark night, this person was sitting in a house with a revolver in his hand and a syringe of heroin in the other, thinking, must be more to life than this. Maybe it's death. And, if you will, before both triggers were pulled, then some little voice, wasn't God speaking, hey, you, don't do that. Just some little sense of maybe not do this. Not out of some sense of fear or anything, it was just there. And so I laid down those. As it turns out, right around the same time, my business partner in illicit drugs, went from West Texas to East Texas to a manufacturer of product to arrange for a shipment. So he does this thing. So he could have been the same day, I don't really know. It just, the time was so not there that it didn't make a difference. But after my decision to not commit suicide, literally the next day I woke up and all I could do was think about God. I grew up not thinking about God. In fact, insisting on not thinking about God. Had really declared myself as an atheist, not knowing what that really meant, or just that, it was cool, and it was certainly a rebellion against what my parents told me. But literally, all I could do was think about God, and I thought that was a little odd, but there was a fullness in that, and that was okay. That was a good thing, actually. I will say that probably within a couple of days of that, I, having been raised on steak and potatoes and corn once a week, decided to become a vegetarian. I also started doing hatha yoga about 4 hours a day. Now, you got to know, 1970-ish in West Texas, there were no yoga instructors. So, and I just started doing hatha yoga. And so my friend comes back within a few days of this, and he comes in. He hasn't made contact with the manufacturer. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, when I got to Denton, that's where he had gone, then our friend took me to this place, this ashram thing. and there was this huge, fat, bald man. And he was doing this thing. His eyes were wide open, and people in the room were kind of jerking and falling over, and there was like this intensity in the room that was like. And he said that was kind of an interesting experience, and I kind of forgot why I was there. So I said, well, okay, fine, I guess we'll starve to death. But that was that. He didn't know this person's name, nothing. So the sequence that happened from that was that I very shortly left that place, Odessa, and moved to Boulder, Colorado. There were a few intervening things that led me to that decision, which are not so relevant, but I found myself in Boulder, Colorado, and I still had this longing, this urge. So I continued to do my hatha yoga and whatever meditation came with that, and explored different spiritual practices and a few well-known teachers there, but nothing really clicked. Turns out that the person who I was living with at the time, who happens to be the mother of my child, was from Indiana. But the odd thing, that wasn't odd. The odd thing was that about every week I met a person from Indiana. And without exception, each person that I met kept saying, Indiana is the greatest place to live on the place of the planet. Well, after a while, I started asking, well, why are you here then? And they, oh, we're just taking a break, etc. I said, okay, fine. Well, after 7-8 months of that, then couldn't really make a living there. I had given up my previous business and still wasn't really capable of working, holding down a job. So we decided to move to Indiana. So we packed up the van with our little bag of clothes and drove across the country, spending about 10 days to drive across Kansas because there's just nothing there. We arrive in Indiana, and about 4 days afterwards, I'm walking down the street, and it was like radar. All of a sudden, it was just and my head turns, and there's a picture of this huge, fat, bald man, and his eyes might as well have been on fire. And I said, holy shit, that's who my friend told me about. Yep, that person there. Had his name there. And it happened to be that he was giving a lecture, and I was in Indianapolis at the time, and he happened to be giving a lecture in Bloomington, which is south of there about an hour, that evening at a place called Wittenberg Auditorium. So we decided to drive down there, and we went to that lecture, and there was about 300 people. Probably the place was full. And we came a little late. And so the only place to sit was up between the stage where his couch he was sitting on and the chairs were, and maybe from here to the pillars there, columns. So we just went down there and sat, and I'm feeling this dynamic that somehow I remembered my friend telling me about this. But it was already clear to me this is the person my friend had told me about. So Rudy gives this lecture. I could not tell you a word he said. And at the end of the lecture, he said, "Does there anybody have any questions?" And my friend made the mistake of raising his hand. Because my friend raised his hand and he said, "How do I grow spiritually?" And Rudy looks down at him and he says, "Well, not by leaving your wife and 3 kids." My friend, shows you the level of the person I was at the time, was living there in Indianapolis and had recently abandoned his wife and 3 kids and was living in sin with 2 other women. Well, my friend got up, screamed, and ran to the outside. And I didn't see him for about 4 days. I think he was just laying in a gutter. That was kind of amazing in itself, but so the lecture was over, Rudy left, and I found out that in fact he was in town from New York and that he was doing this transmission thing at this little place. So the next day I went and was able to get into the class, and it was an interesting experience because the room was a 3-bedroom house in Bloomington, Indiana, and the meditation room was probably, 20 by 20. Not a big place. Well, I came in, because I had gotten this little intro, and I came in a little late, and the room was so full, and then the person in the back room kept saying, "Move up." So people were moving up and moving up and moving up. And I come in, and another at least 10 people seemed to come in behind me. Seems like the space just kind of kept expanding to fit the need. And Rudy began his class. He opened his eyes, and he gave what is called Shaktipat transmission. Well, the short end of the story is the rest is history. That was the pivotal moment in my own sadhana. At least I thought that was the pivotal moment in my own sadhana. Shortly, not such a long time after that, then I realized that the pivotal moment in my own sadhana was when my friend told me about Rudy. The pivotal moment in my sadhana was grace. For no good reason, not that I, quote, deserved it, certainly wasn't looking for it. Something happened that sprung forth this longing in me and propelled me to go on this little drive around the country to end up meeting Rudy. That was about 50 years ago. I tell you this story because it is a very clear example, if you will, of Shaktipada, of the descent of grace. And as we've read, and we'll talk a little bit about, right? And that descent of grace is the pivotal moment in our sadhana. It is the reason we come to our sadhana. It's not all the reasons we think we come to our sadhana. All the pain that we want to get over, all the struggle, all the suffering, all of this, all of that. These are really the experiences that we are having when that grace hasn't descended. Well, let's be clear, we keep having those experiences, but because of that descent, because of that unfolding, that awakening that's happening in us, then we do begin to experience our experience from a completely different place. I'm sure that if we went around the room, that each of you might have an equally compelling story. So I wanted to share that with you because for me in my life has been one thing, and that's been a response to that grace, a response to that moment. And all of the sadhana, all of the challenge, all of the change, all of the surrender has always been, I was going to say made easily, but we'll say made more easy, in context of remembering that. And I hope through our discussions that you'll really understand that when we talk about the descent of grace, we talk about that, what I describe grace as the freedom bestowing power of the divine. When we talk about that it is only God that bestows grace. There may be some sense of some grace of a teacher or of a lineage, etc., etc. And these are simply agents of that same grace. The reason we come to our sadhana is because God called us home. Period. And isn't it extraordinary that miracle takes place in our life? Not really dependent on our condition, not really dependent on our calling, our asking for it, but simply because God chose to do so. And traditional scripture traditions talks at length, some talk at length, some argue with themselves about the whole thing, right? About why grace descends on one person versus another. And only God knows that. And the point is, it doesn't really make a difference. What makes a difference for us is that descent has taken place. That longing somehow has been pulled out of the dungeon of our own self and begins to make its way to the surface. I always try to encourage everyone that I meet, practice with me, not practice with me, to be crystal clear about the miracle and that is the possibility of freedom. That is the miracle and the possibility that's available to us, to me, to you, to each of us. In some ways, perhaps that's the most simplest way to describe grace. The miracle of freedom. And when the brain starts working, at least maybe it should say, well, my God, what would have happened if that miracle didn't take place? Well, in my case, I'd still be in Odessa, Texas, selling bait and donuts out of a gasoline shop, probably selling drugs out the back door. Because, honestly, there was nothing in my life, and certainly nothing in my awareness, up to that moment that could have had any rational reason to call forth that possibility. So as we talk about grace a little bit tonight, and particularly when we talk about the different degrees of it, the intensity of that, you're going to understand that experience that I just described is the most common experience of grace. At least, if you will, understood within the non-dual tantrika tradition. I will say that after 50 years of sadhana, I wish I knew then what I know now. Because all the hubbub and all the fight and all the drama and all the resistance and all the kicking back and all the running away screaming and all the vacations that we take, probably we would be a little less, we would succumb a little less to those if we could actually, remember that moment, but probably more importantly, if we had a clue what that moment was going to bring to us. And so then, of course, we do our sadhana. But I think one of the things that I want you to be really thoughtful about is that what is it that propels us to go through all the challenge, to go through all the difficulty, to go through all the changes that we go through and that we face, etc. What is it that propels us to keep our light on Jesus, our eyes on Jesus? That my brother's a born-again Christian. Every time he leaves you, he says, keep your eye on Jesus. And I always say, yes, sir. Well, unfortunately, he means that. But I translate it into light of any kind. And I think the thing that I want you to consider is that the thing that propels us is not us. The thing that propels us is not what is that we think we are doing sadhana, that we think we're trying to free ourselves from suffering. But that in fact, it is in fact God, Shiva, that consciousness, revealing itself within its own contracted state. So we think, descent of grace. Okay, here it comes. I can feel it. It's raining down. And maybe you've had such an experience like that. Hallelujah. Nice to be rained on. But even this slight possibility, when we talk about it as a descent of grace, is somehow suggesting to us that grace is descending from somewhere to some other place. That God is up there, got a bunch of angels with him, and they're all spreading fairy dust. Angel dust. Let's be respectful, right? And that dust is falling on us, and it penetrates into our skin and our awareness, and some awakening takes place. There is no such possibility. If, as we're talking about in our discussions here, that the view, the darshana of non-dual practices means there is not two. There is not something above and something below. There's not something above that is separate from or outside of something below itself that it rains down on. Because that inherently is saying there's two. And I won't deny to you that you may have powerful experiences of that sense, of some God outside yourself, above yourself, somehow instructing, giving information, guiding. And that's the extraordinary, wonderful dynamic of non-duality, is that experience of duality, that experience of two-ness, is happening in the field and the experience of oneness. It is happening, if you will, in God's experience of oneness. And that descent really can be understood as the descent of consciousness in its most supreme, infinite, unbounded self, descending into the very manifestation of it that it's created within and from itself. We can get real personal about that and mean individuals, us. So that pure joy and simple awareness, that freedom, remember the term svatantriya we talked about, absolute autonomous freedom, that is somehow diminished, lost, as individuation takes place. It is that same freedom that descends into itself, revealing in that individual self its own pure freedom. And I say this to you because if we just put our lives into I was going to say a little perspective, but at least a different perspective, and we start to be still enough to recognize the extraordinary miracle that is taking place in our individual lives, the extraordinary possibility to know the God that dwells within us as ourselves. That's the grace. The possibility is the grace. And it manifests in whatever way, if you will. It takes on whatever form or thought or experience it needs to as it descends back into the density of its own consciousness. Remember we talked about the levels of consciousness, the tattvas, and how this pure, unbounded awareness descends into form, descends into manifestation, and in that process somehow loses contact with itself. Well, that's what's happening when grace descends. It's descending into its own awareness and revealing within itself that that's not something that's happening outside of itself, but that it is simply the expression of its own freedom to be free in the first place. And if you can just get still with this for a moment, you just have to. The shock and awe of it is amazing. And if you can come in contact with that, then you can also engage your own life, you can engage your own experience, you can engage your own sadhana from that perspective. And so much of the struggle to be free of struggle just falls away. Just falls away. Because we are responding to the very again, if I use the word God and it sends some ripple up your spine, well actually that'd be good. If it makes your brain wiggle, I'm sorry. We are responding to God. And in that process, then the fundamental sadhana, the fundamental awareness that we bring to our life is surrender. And if we can surrender to that power that is, if you will, revealing itself within us because it chose to free us, then freedom is possible. As our friend Harish said, and I think it was his dissertation on Shaktipada, that freedom is inevitable. Of course, we get to turn the dial on the speed of that inevitability. The term, I think I wrote about it in here, that is so beautiful, anugraha, the unfolding of himself. The unfolding of herself. We can take it all out of that whole discussion, and the unfolding of consciousness. Well, where is that unfolding taking place? I can't say Sacramento anymore because my friends in Sacramento think I'm disparaging Sacramento when I say it, so we'll say, is it taking place in Odessa, Texas? Well, my response is hell no. It's not possible. But that unfolding is not taking place outside of itself. It's not taken outside of its inherent autonomous freedom. It is the expression of that autonomous freedom. The same autonomous freedom that, if you will, concealed itself in manifestation, that concealed itself in individuality. But don't lose sight that it is that pure consciousness that concealed itself in individuality. And it is that same consciousness that reveals itself in that individuality. What's called the fivefold acts of the divine. We haven't talked about that too much, I don't think. But it's really, it is important to touch on this, because the fivefold acts of the divine are creation, maintenance, dissolution, concealing, and revealing. That's what she was doing all the time. All at once. You know, a day in a life for each of us. Those first three, well, let's back it up a little bit. We be born, we go to the gym and work out, we get on a ketogenic diet, we don't get on a ketogenic diet, we don't work out. We go through this whole dynamic in that maintenance phase. And then at some point, the body falls. No matter how much dieting we did, how much exercise we did, how much non-exercise we didn't do it, etc. By the way, it's not an excuse to be unconscious. Right? Right. That is the cycle of life. There's a beautiful phrase, and I have to find it, but it basically is saying, when Shiva opens his eyes, the world appears. And when he closes his eyes, it disappears. In a simple way, beautiful way of saying that when things externalize, that in that externalization there is the in one dimension of that experience a concealing that takes place. Now let's back that up just one moment to say that those four phases, those pure powers that we've been talking about of consciousness, joy, will, knowledge, and action, we call them the pure powers, and we call them the impure powers when somehow we have misunderstood them. All of that expression, all that creation happens within consciousness, with consciousness not losing sight of itself. In fact, before creation happens, if you want to think of it, in God's imagination, He creates the universe. And then, bada bing, bada boom, bing bang, big bang, it happens, right? But even in that simple, pure, infinite consciousness does not have a sense, oh, look what I did. I made a baby. God says, look what's happening as me. Not look what's happening outside of me. But to get it into real brass tacks for us, and what we're going to talk about for the rest of the year, for those of you who participate, what happens in that process we'll be real specific. What happens in the process of individuation is that pure consciousness is concealed within a limited bandwidth of consciousness that it's within itself. And that grace is the revelation that takes place within that same limited bandwidth of consciousness that is revealing from within that experience of duality, from within the experience of individuality, that I'm not separate from my Creator, and ends up to, well, by gum, I'm the Creator. Now that's cool. Can't wait. But understand those fivefold acts of the divine, that revelation, anugraha, the unfolding of that pure consciousness, revealing itself into our limited consciousness, is really what we're talking about when we talk about grace. Unbounded consciousness descends into bound consciousness. And what is it doing when it does that? It's putting in a memory stick. What are those little things you call it? You stick in flash drive. It's reinstalling, if you will, a place in us that remembers who we are, that never forgot who we were. It is the beginning of that unfolding, and that unfolding is what's called sadhana. We're going to talk very specifically over the course of the program about what we talked on this a little bit, called the upayas. Upayas means deliberation. We're going to correlate that with Kundalini, the ascent of Kundalini. Remember we said that svatantriya, that absolute autonomous power, creates within it, expresses itself as Kundalini Shakti, which is the Shakti that creates the world and specifically creates us as individuals. That same Shakti is the same power that we are seeking to, if you will, to awaken within ourselves, to allow it to ascend both in its ascent in our own consciousness. If supreme consciousness descends into individual limited consciousness, then it is the ascent of limited consciousness into universal consciousness that is our sadhana. And that's specifically tied to it within the aspects of non-dual practices in the practice of Kundalini sadhana. The awakening of Kundalini. We talked about the 3 levels of that, and we'll talk about it more. But those upayas, which means that the means to liberation, and as we said, there are 4, but there are 3 that we get to do anything about. Anavopaya, the path of effort, the path of individual effort. Our next module. Shaktopaya, the path of energy, and Shambhavopaya, the path of awareness. The 4th is called Anupaya, which means no path. The 4th is called Anupaya, means no path. those upayas are a continuum. They're also a nonlinear progression, meaning that any one of them can lead us to our freedom. While they seem to lead one to another, it's really the expansion of our own consciousness that's taking place. And so the upayas, I'll make sure I say it right. It says here, back here, you don't have to find it. It says, upayas are both the means to liberation and the state of consciousness experienced within ourselves. The state of Shiva consciousness experienced within ourselves. What does that say to us? That says that when grace descends, it's like the highest level of grace fills a little hole in the top of your head, and he fills your entire being with pure awareness. You're just completely filled. Isn't that a nice visual? Well, it's true. There is a little hole in the top of your head. The same one in which you move back out. But don't get me started on that yet. Right. That highest grace completely fills our limited awareness with unlimited awareness. That's called anupaya. And you can look at that, we could draw a picture here, and we could say anupaya fills the whole thing, and the next picture could say that shambhavapaya, the path of awareness, means this grace fills us up to here. Well, let's say it fills us from here down to here. We'll go down, right? And that, if you will, the lowest form of grace. How can there be a low form of grace after what we just talked about? There cannot be a low form of grace. It's called levels of intensity. That depending on where we start in our sadhana is in fact the level of revelation, the level of unfolding that has taken place from us in that moment of descent. Where we look and say, oh, now that arm, that's God. The rest of that, yuck, right? Where some part of us recognizes our own divinity. Or a little more of us ourselves recognizes our own divinity. Or our complete being recognizes our own being. I am Shiva, the path of awareness. Or anupaya, the flooding of insight. And it's not even I am Shiva, it's just Shiva saying I am. So the reason that it's important that we correlate grace with the upayas is that we're grading ourselves. is that we're recognizing that grace has descended in us. And whatever intensity of the light that happened in that descent, God turns the grace valve on, and he turns it and it floods for a while, and then he turns it off, and, if he got distracted with an email, he might have left it open for a long time, and we just get completely filled up. That where we find ourselves is where we begin our sadhana. And that is the point of the upayas. That is the point of sadhana. Is that we may have a fleeting moment. May have been a drive-by car going 90 miles an hour. Wow, what was that? Oh, wait, that was me. I was God. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, right. or just in a flash, that pure revelation dissolves all misunderstanding. Well, we won't get to it tonight. The reading that you all did, I'm sure, when you talk about those 9 levels, right, in the back, describes that perfectly. Describes the highest descent of grace as, I like to call it, spontaneous combustion. Because that flooding of insight is so powerful that the body cannot sustain itself. Now, some people might say, I would say, I wish I was that lucky. Some people might say, I'm glad I wasn't that lucky. It is not our bodies that we need to be worried that goes away. It is not our bodies that descent of grace is intending to combust. It is our limited consciousness that is being unfolded. That is grace. So particularly the sadhana that we do is the response to grace. My personal experience is that response, the inevitability of freedom, is determined by the intensity of our sadhana. That the same, if you will, the intensity of grace, it's medium superior half-baked latte, right, is relevant, but just as relevant is the intensity of our sadhana, the intensity of our wish, the intensity of our dedication. It's the intensity of our surrender. It is the clarity of our longing that we don't. It's not like, well, God descended. Yeah, okay, I long for God. Okay, now let me get on with my life and forget about that. We in that longing is the moment of that springs forth in our heart, and to the degree, to the intensity in which we feed ourselves into that longing determines the speed of that inevitability of freedom. I just want to read this. That's really the first page, the first paragraph of the handout that I gave you. It says, the purpose of tantric sadhana is union with God. The Sanskrit term Shiva Vyapti means the total reabsorption into supreme consciousness, back into that from which we came, into Shiva, the true self. Any individual who finds him or herself feeling and responding to such an inner wish to be reabsorbed and to live in God, even if it's only a whisper, should understand that that wish is the most profound moment of grace. This is because it is only by grace that the emission of individuality is called back into universal source. There's this extraordinary dynamic between our own experience, but let's be honest with ourselves, in most cases, is an experience of duality. I want to know God. There's an extraordinary dynamic between that and the underlying field, that it is God revealing himself in you, which is why you want to know God. That's extraordinary. There's lengthy discussion about why grace descends more in one person than the other. Some people say it's like the little stars that you get when you're in school. You get a gold star, and I never got one. I don't know why, but it was all my teacher's fault. They just didn't understand me, right? That we accumulate merit, and that's how we accumulate enough little stars that we. Remember back in the day when they had green stamps, and you filled up the books. Oh my God! And you go and you got the little toaster. Well, I was going to say a little gun outfit and a hat, cowboy hat, because I'm from Texas, right? But you got to trade that in for something of value that you wanted, right? That we accumulate enough merit by doing good that we can trade it in. Other lengthy discussion is that it's the accumulation of unmerit, karma, that determines whether we receive grace or not. And then those people got together and argued, and finally came up with the agreement that it was both. That it was both merit and undoing unmerit. That's called seva. Oh wait, that's next week's discussion, in a couple of weeks, right? That our karma is a profound, if you will, influencer. You can say on God, but mostly on what happens through our perpetual willfulness, our self-serving willfulness, which is what karma is that the density of our own consciousness gets denser and denser. And so maybe that's grace is raining down on us, but our own awareness is so thick, so self-absorbed, that nothing can penetrate. In fact, when you read the 9 degrees there, you'll see an interesting discussion about the last 3 phases, right? Where grace descends, but basically it just means, man, I got to get what I want in the world, right? That's the predominant thing. The wonderful thing about that discussion is grace is descending on everybody. Being alive is grace. When that creation of us into ourselves, that is grace. And, it's not like God popped us out and then forgot about us. That same freedom of expression, of joy, the joy of creation, is perpetually raining down on us. And then we be popped out, we grow up, and we start slinging shit and causing trouble and making trouble and getting all self-absorbed. And then that we go through our whole life doing that, and then, we'll come back and do it again, and we keep doing the same thing, and the whole thing just gets tighter and tighter. And so then that same descent, that same capacity, freedom-bestowing power of God, which is always raining down on us, simply cannot get through. So let's be grateful that for each of us in this room, or any room like this, that enough got through that we're willing to go sit in a room like this and listen to a weirdo like me, whatever the dynamic is. Right? That moment where that longing sprung forth, that is the supreme moment of grace. What happens from that? Nityananda said once, pretty clear statement, we alone are responsible for our happiness or our misery. Now, this is a person who was divine grace, but clearly understood the responsibility that we have to respond to that grace, and that it doesn't make a difference whether that grace was this big or that big. It's like being a beggar and somebody gives us a little food and we say, well, that's not enough. Rudy always talked about that as the way we go through life is we're invited to the gourmet what's a buffet, yeah, and we stop at the door and start eating the peanuts, and we get so filled up with the peanuts that we have gas, right, and indigestion, and we leave. But we never get to the offering, right? This is sadhana. This is consciousness. This is the cultivation of that wish. And in fact, you'll see that the fundamental focus of Anavopaya is the cultivation of that wish, which I also say is the opening of our heart. I'm going to stop and let you ask questions about that, and if you want to ask questions in some of the other modules, I always talk longer than I think I'm going to about one particular thing, but you let me get started, so. So I'll stop, and you're going to ask questions about what I just said, or about the handout, or some previous handout, or something I haven't said, or something handout that I haven't given. It's your nickel. Do we have a microphone? Yes. Who would like to ask the questions? Up, the lady in front. Well, the lady in purple in front.
Yes, I don't know. I mean, obviously, Rudy had moments of grace, and maybe more than one, like when he experienced Nityananda, and when he did he swam and walked around. But I'm just wondering if you think he's an example of his samadhi. Do you think that's an example of this spontaneous combustion?
You mean the fact that he flew into the side of a mountain? Well, he didn't blow up and just combust. No. Because that degree of intensity is what happened in the moment of revelation. His sadhana, if you will, was the response to some moment of grace that happened in him. And him, it happened when he was about 8 years old, and these Tibetan Rinpoche showed up, and started putting all these what are called tormas. Tormas means knowledge, right? And putting this inside him and telling him that the knowledge that we're installing would reveal itself, right? So the grace is not the end; it's the beginning, right?
So I seem to remember you saying something at the retreat about that whatever level of grace you start with, even if you're starting, I mean, that 5th level doesn't sound so bad.
Yeah, no, it sounds good.
Yeah, exactly. But you come in and then you find your teacher. Does that let you skip in the line? Or are you sort of leveled out where you come in?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And look, grace, only God bestows grace. And that intensity of grace, that moment, depending on the intensity of that revelation that takes place, That's, if you will, where we start. Now, grace doesn't happen once. It keeps revealing itself, but it's the same intensity, right? It's the same song keeps playing itself over, and it's Groundhog Day, right? What's that song that was playing when they were there? Sonny and Cher, right? The point is, it is. You can think of it as more as a frequency. So the highest is 10 and the lowest is a 1, right? So the intensity that we all experience, we'll say it's a 7 or a 3. It doesn't make a difference. That frequency penetrates through us and remains. Right? So then we start from that frequency and we get to tune our device to connect to the next level of intensity, but not the level of intensity of grace, because we don't create grace, we don't bestow grace on ourselves. Because that descent of grace is the exposure, the revelation of a certain level of consciousness within us. And so whatever that level of consciousness in us is where we start from. And as the little statement said, that level of consciousness is the level of our identification with Shiva, meaning the level of our non-identification with ourself. So if we see our left arm is that's Shiva and we're not sure about the rest, then we start trying to bring that awareness into the rest of the body in that sense. Right. But so the grace doesn't disappear, it's a constant, right? But it's not like that after 50 years of our sadhana that God decides, I better give him some more grace. The grace is the unfolding. Now, I will say that as that unfolding takes place, what's really happening? More of God and less of us. A more profound dynamic of realization. And at some point, every moment becomes a new revelation, a deeper realization, right? And so then it feels like grace has descended again. That's why we understand and have to live in profound gratitude and worship to that grace of that moment. Not, well, wait a minute, God, you gave me a 2. I know I deserved a 6, right? My friend got a 9, and he's a jerk, right? Right? Which can happen. Even jerks can get a higher one than us non-jerks, right? God is perspicacious, or whatever that word is, right? Right. So you understand?
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering if you don't come in at a 3, then you don't get Jivan Mukti. There's no way you can get to Jivan Mukti.
Yes. Every level, no matter what, the moment that God reveals himself in you, no matter how foggy the environment that he's doing in it, is creating the miracle of the possibility of Jivan Mukti, of freedom while alive.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Yes.
That's really...
Yes. Yeah. Those first 2 stages that are described in there is Jivan Mukti to such an extent that the highest the body falls away. Understand, consciousness doesn't fall away. The body just falls away. Which, oh, by the way, is going to happen. 3rd phase of God's act is your body's going to fall away. What will be left? What will be left of your consciousness? Well, what will be left if we don't do our sadhana, if we don't respond to grace, is I was my body. And because I left thinking I was my body, guess what? We get another one. But freedom is not coming back and having another body, except if you choose so. not if you're required so. Right? Great saints can, at the time of their passing, choose when they're leaving and whether they return in a body, even if they're freed from all body. So is that helpful?
Yeah, that is helpful. Thank you.
Good. Somebody else? Man, I either did a really bad or a really good job. Over here, please.
I'm just curious what the role of karma is in relation to the grace that you are initially given. Is there any relationship, or?
No. The person over there, his name is Padmasambhava. The greatest saint, was the father of Tibetan Buddhism, was a really bad guy. I mean, really bad guy. And then at some moment, God said, don't do that, do this. And that's the mystery of it. And that's why I said, God's decision to awaken in us is not determined on us or anything we've done or not done, which is part of the bad argument is, well, I don't have to worry about doing good things, right? Because if this grace is only going to happen when God chooses, then I might as well just party down, right, and do what I want because I'm not in control here. Well, you can live by that rule, right? But there is no restriction, if you will, on God's deciding to descend in himself based on the history of the individual. But I think that doesn't mean that there's not a result, right? There's a lovely line that says, whatever's on your mind when you die is on your mind when you're reborn, right? Unless you're not reborn, right? Because Jivan Mukti means there's not a me to have something on my mind, right? So it's a wonderful discussion, and the importance of understanding seva, and particularly of understanding seva in relationship to the upayas, and in the relationship to the freeing of those three veils that we talked about, is really critical. Because ultimately what we realize in every level of seva is that seva, while it has in some sense some dualistic experience, is not a dualistic experience. Because there is no dualistic experience except in dualistic experience, right? So sadhana is freedom from individuality. I should say liberation is freedom from individuality. God has no karma. So we don't have karma when we're God. So the rules about karma are very simple. Stop doing it. Face the karma that you might have created in the first place, before you stop doing it, right? Which means you have to live through your karma. Now, I will say that every moment of every day isn't a karmic dynamic. Oh, well, this happened to me because of my karma. My point is there are serious, real karmic repercussions in our life. Every single thing we do, we cut somebody off on the highway. It's not a big karmic debt, right? There's also within that individual consciousness what are called vasanas, impressions. So just our own impression of life is either reinforcing that density of our own consciousness or opening that. And that may not have anything to do with anybody else, quote, in karma that we've created. So there's a whole milieu of things that affect, if you will, reinforce the density of individual consciousness. So my advice is always, do good works, right? But the highest level of seva is what? Serving God who's serving himself by revealing freedom. Is that helpful at all?
Yes,
Good.
thank you.
I think Nan must have a question because her brows are... What I'm saying is, look, if there is only pure consciousness, then there's only pure consciousness. And if our individual experience is the dynamic expression of that pure consciousness, that anything that's happening in that individual experience is happening in that pure consciousness. So all seva that we do is really the highest level of that seva is simply the allowing, the serving of God in his revelation of his own freedom. And the extraordinary thing is we are the beneficiary of that service because it's our freedom that's really happening, except that it's really only God's freedom. Is that helpful? There must be other questions. Yes, please, up here.
So you're saying that grace is God waking us up.
Yes.
Okay. But are there... So I do a lot of counseling, and people come to me all the time. I'm actually a career counselor. So people come to me all the time looking for something to satisfy them, thinking it's going to be a certain job or right. And I think what they're really looking for is this.
Mm-hmm.
But they're unconscious of they're looking for this.
Of course.
Right. So where is grace in that?
That level 8 and 9 that you're reading in the in the thing there. Look, if you understand and think of grace as the miracle of being, everybody is the expression of grace, right? The descent of grace in this discussion means that there is an awakening that is called forth in us to know the God that created us. That's really what it's talking about. A person who might come to a person like yourself wanting some advice about something may not have experienced any form of grace. In fact, perhaps you can say it hasn't, right? Except that all of those questions, all of that, I need this, won't my life be better, that is the inquiry. It is actually that same clarity of consciousness, trying to understand. But unfortunately, it's trying to understand through the level of consciousness in us called ego, that can only understand in its capacity to reinforce itself. And so then an ego fundamentally is two. There's me and there's something else. Ultimately, that experience of ego is the level of consciousness that experiences separation. My joke is every country western song ever sung is about separation from God, right? It doesn't sound like it. I'm sure God doesn't sing through his nose in the first place, right?
Looking for love in all the wrong places.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's the point. All of the reaching that every person on the planet does, even the people who are in the most dire physical situations, is the attempt to find that God within themselves. Now, people who are just fighting to survive, you can't, some poor person who hadn't eaten in 12 days or 3 months, you can't say, well, God really exists within you, so take a breath, right? I will say that modern day people, we could say, probably even narrow it to Westerners particularly, right, somehow are caught in this incredible dynamic of somehow thinking that there's something outside of themselves that's going to satisfy that which it cannot satisfy. And there is a perpetual longing for something to fill us that cannot fill us. And it perpetuates itself. Most people go through life with that hunt, if you will. Spiritual awakening, when we talk about descent, we're talking about that some part of us inside of us, the part that buried underneath all the feeling of separation, is just a whisper, a whiff that knows it's not separate. And that's where that longing comes from.
And as a counselor, I find that sometimes if I can ask the right question, I always say that really all that's happening is people are coming to me to meet themselves.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
And that my job is to do that. And I also believe that people actually do know what they want to do.
Right.
But there's too much ego or habituated thought covering up that,
Yes.
for them. So when you said it can only come from, grace can only, I get that, but I'm hoping that if we meet the right teacher, whether it's you or somebody else, that you can help to at least fuel the flame of the person who's coming and asking the
yes,
question.
but I think the fundamental or the subtle difference is, and again, that third level where grace happens and this longing springs forth, and it propels us to find a spiritual teacher, right? That is that same awakening, calling forth to itself the insight and the energy that it needs to fuel its own awakening. That's all the relationship with the teacher is, right? And that is again, if you study those things, you'll see it. Everything after that is kind of a debate between, is grace, meaning I'm really going to focus more on the pleasures of the world versus being free. Okay, in this one, I want both, but, well, if I have to choose, right, then I'm going to choose the pleasures, et cetera, et cetera. So that is the moment where freedom is inevitable. And yes, that experience of that longing that springs forth and the search for a teacher, the search for that energy and guidance, etc., that can free us, is the common experience of people who have a spiritual life. What my experience in watching that over 50 years is that as powerful as that is, I would say as many people or more people that takes place, more people walk away from that at some point than stay with that. And that's a head scratcher for me, right? Because it's the same level of intensity. It is the same song that keeps replaying itself. And somehow, because in that process of unfolding, of the freeing of ourselves of limited consciousness, of freeing ourselves from ego, right, then some part of us says, no, I'm not going to do that and you can't make me. And we walk away from our practice. I think I've said it perhaps recently. My experience in watching people is that most people's sadhana lasts about 7 years. Or it lasts 50. true, authentic sadhana. Because we will come up with moments where we must truly surrender ourselves. We must truly surrender our limited consciousness. We must truly surrender to the very grace that's calling forth and revealing an unlimited consciousness in us. And if we're unwilling to do that, then we've taken that same power of will, God's intention to express freedom, and we've dumbed it down to our own will that says, no, I'll even deny my own freedom. And what is the most supreme act of willfulness? It's denying the freedom that's trying to reveal itself in us. But we have that power because God's powers are our powers. And that's the essence of sadhana. Will we use these powers of creation? Will we use these powers of capacity to allow ourselves to be freed, if you want to think of it that way, or will we not? And that requires extraordinary diligence, and diligence of consciousness that remembers why we're doing what we're doing. And it's so easy for us to get caught up in some moment of profound catharsis, and we forget why that catharsis is there in the first place, and we pull back. Is that helpful?
Very, thank
Yes.
you. I just want to say that I feel like this homework reading clarified 50 years of curiosity.
So pleased.
Thank you.
Yes, great. I think it's time to stop unless there is a burning question. So this is the end of this Shakespearean act. And for those of you who are continuing, I look forward to that. And those of you who are not, then I thank you very much and hope this has been valuable. And I hope it has clarified 50 years of uncertainty. Let's close our eyes for a minute. As the sign-off line of, remember Gracie and Alan? The last line was, say goodnight, Grace.